Well, that is a great setup. We are going to now talk about how research has shown that teams that have a diversity of thought, experience, and skills just outperform other teams. So how can organizations develop the pipelines to create a more diverse workforce? We're going to explore that with Michael Heider, who is a Chief Diversity Officer at Korn Ferry. Bo-Young Lee is a Chief Diversity Officer at Uber. And Celeste Warren is Vice President, Global Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence Leader at Merck. Welcome to all of you. Celeste, I want to ask about your approach, because you're in the unique position of being a diversity and inclusion leader at a company with a black CEO. Has that, and particularly his focus on making progress in this area, made a difference for you?
Well, it definitely has made a difference for me as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Merck, having a CEO like Ken Frazier, who is very passionate about diversity, very passionate about inclusion, and also brings his life story into how he exudes that passion. He has accountability, and he demands that of his executive committee, his direct reports, the leaders of the organization. And through that leadership, we're working to drive accountability all the way through the management line so that we can make progress.
And Celeste, you have said that your approach to diversity in the organization really is focused on the bottom line, on making sure that value gets added to the organization through the pursuit of these goals. Why is that important to the long-term sustainability of these efforts?
Well, we absolutely have to make sure that our diversity and inclusion strategy is helping to drive our business strategy. We're in the business of saving and improving lives. And so if my diversity and inclusion strategy doesn't enable that, then we're just on the outside looking in at the business. So we want to make sure that diversity and inclusion that lens is there through our drug discovery, development, manufacturing, marketing, and commercial processes. And that involves making sure that we have diversity in our clinical trials, for example, in our research labs, making sure that we are leveraging diversity and inclusion in our marketing and our commercial strategies, because our patients are very diverse around the globe. And we have to make sure that our workforce reflects that diversity. Because I always tell our leaders, it's not enough that you have a group of people who are interpreting what they think our patients might need in many of our communities, but they have to have those employees in those communities in the room as they're putting together the strategies, so they can help us to understand what are some of the barriers and obstacles to patients in their communities being able to receive the ultimate health outcomes that we want them to have.
And Bo, at Uber, I see an interesting challenge potentially for you guys in that the contractors, the drivers, for example, on your platform tend to be a pretty diverse group of people. At the corporate level, the picture is probably quite a bit different. How do you both serve partners who are in a diverse community and make sure that that community has access to corporate opportunities and that corporate is receptive to diverse points of view and experiences?
Absolutely. And just like Celeste said, the importance of diversity and inclusion comes down to the people that we serve, our customers, our clients, and our driver partners and couriers as well. And we know that in order for us to build the best products, the products that meet the needs of our customers and our stakeholders, we need to have that perspective. So from the very beginning, listening to those communities has always been very important, asking them, not making the assumption that we know what they need, but asking them, going into the communities, seeing what their needs are. And actually, one of the things that not a lot of people know, but Uber has always actively sought to bring in that talent. Over the last few years, we've actually brought in several thousand of our driver partners in as full-time employees to help us, from a customer service perspective, but also from a product perspective and engineering perspective. So we want that point of view. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what diversity and inclusion is about. We know that our customer base is so diverse. We know that what safety means to them, what service means to them varies from person to person. And unless we have that point of view, we're just not going to create the best products.
And Bo, these are volatile times, especially for any business that involves people going out and moving around. You guys have had to do some significant cuts, or you have, whether you had to or not, I guess is not mine to judge. Where does diversity and inclusion come to play in there? Because as many of us have seen, oftentimes companies will talk about diversity and diversify when times are good, but then when times are bad, people of color disproportionately end up getting cut.
Yeah. So that was so important for us as we were going through a lot of our restructuring over the past spring. We really wanted to make sure that we were making business decisions with always the lens of equity through inclusion as well. And so all decisions were always done through that lens of equity. My team was heavily involved in it. And, because we didn't want through this period of time we've made so much progress as a company since 2017. We've made so many improvements from a representation of women, from people of color, and we didn't want this period of time to be a moment where we lost some of that momentum. And the really wonderful thing is that throughout all of this, diversity and inclusion has stayed front and center. I think you may have seen over the last few months, Uber has been making some pretty bold statements about becoming an anti-racist company. And we live and breathe that every single day. So even though it has been, a challenging period of time, not just for us, but for everyone, diversity and inclusion has actually helped lead some of the way that we've showed up. It has diversity and inclusion has allowed us to lead with a lot of empathy and care during this really difficult time.
Michael Heider, we've heard from a couple of companies about how they're looking at diversity and from very different perspectives. I wonder what you think about this moment that we're in and the way the country is focused on at least the brand of diversity. I'm not sure yet whether we're getting deeper into the substance of it, if real change in approach is going to happen. What do you see happening, and is it any different from previous moves or moments or notions that you've seen?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Relative to the moment, what is clearly happening is organizations are more conscious of the need to have this dialogue, and what feels different from years past is that there seems to be a genuine interest in wanting to think about solutions and outcomes as opposed to just merely identifying the issue. It is heightened to a great degree at the CEO and even at the board level. And I guess the curiosity of wanting to figure out how to make a measurable difference so that it is the outcomes are clear and expected versus it just being something that is an episode for the moment is what I see that's really fundamentally different than the way the discussions have been in the past.
Well, Michael, that's you said measurable, and that's my question to you next is about data. How important is data and a constant flow of data and identifying the right data for the organization to manage to really making sure that the right kinds of issues are being addressed, progress is being made, goals are being targeted?
Well, I think data is absolutely required, just as managing a business and its P&L is required, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is no exception. And organizations ought to have a clear sense of baseline information relative to hiring rates, promotion rates, exit rates for people by gender, by ethnicity, a sense of what the turnover processes are and ratios are. So I think what is really important, and I'm glad you asked that question, what's really important is data provides an opportunity to be more targeted from a solutions perspective versus just being all over the place, running in circles, wondering what's wrong with the picture that we're seeing. And data allows you to be able to measure effectively how you're doing against those specific objectives. So data is everything. And I think the thirst for that has increased dramatically in recent months.
So Celeste, at Merck, what have you found are some of the most important data points? I hear a lot about measuring the diversity of a candidate pool or people coming in the door, even at entry-level positions. I hear less about retention rates. I hear less about promotion rates. What do you think are both the most important data points and perhaps the most important data points that get overlooked?
Well, I think the bottom line is you want a workforce that is diverse and mirrors the in our case, patient base or your customer base or the labor force. And so the bottom line data is representation, and it's basically those numbers of how many of diverse groups that you have in your organization. So that's the basic one. That's the ultimate, the end where you're trying to achieve. But you have to measure it at the various different levels in the organization. So at your executive level, at the manager level, at the first line manager level, and at your professional levels as well. And then another thing that it gets overlooked, that I think a lot of companies make the mistake of, is you look at women and then you look at persons of color or underrepresented ethnic groups. And those usually are comprised of African Americans, Latino and Hispanic, Asian, and Indigenous or Native American. And instead of looking at the information together, you have to look at each of those groups separately. So disaggregate the data, look at what's happening in the Asian community, look at what's happening in your Latino and Hispanic community, look at what's happening in your African American community. What does the data tell you about entry, about promotions, about lateral moves, about development, and promotions? What does the data tell you about each of those different segments of the population? And then you have to put together strategies to really address each of those needs. Because looking at them all together, you could basically not be missing a very critical aspect of your diversity strategy.
Bo, does human resources tend to have the access to both the granular data in the right formats and the skill set to analyze it that would be required to do what Celeste is talking about?
Well, I think that's it's about the evolution of what human resources is, right? Certainly at Uber, we have both the access to and also the skill set to develop, to look at that data. And actually, one of the recent analyses that my team actually ran is a large-scale regression-based model to actually identify not just the correlated metrics around diversity, representation, and development, but actually to identify some of the causal factors of career progression, about attrition in our organization. And it's simply about rethinking what human resources looks like. And also, of course, beyond human resources, looking at working with your data scientists, working with your economists, working with different parts of the organization, working with the engineering and technology groups, because the one thing I think people make a mistake is assuming that if your organization has a diversity and inclusion department, they own the whole entire strategy. They own the whole entire execution. But in fact, actually, the companies that are making the most progress, they actually have a relatively smaller D&I team. But what they do is they make D&I a part of everybody's responsibility. So it's not simply about Bo or the chief diversity officer driving it. It is about the CTO, it is about the head of your operations, the people who run the P&L. They're the ones. And so in Uber's approach, and I know this is true for many companies, we look at a very cross-functional, cross-collaborative way of driving diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, Michael, we say D&I and we refer to diversity and inclusion. It might as well stand for data and inquiry at a certain level, too. So I wonder if you are an HR leader who has not in the past had the capabilities to do the level of analysis that's going to be required to help the organization move forward. How do you make the ask for those resources? Or if you are a CEO and you recognize that your HR department does not have the capability to do what's needed to move the organization forward, how do you build that in so that you're not lacking from a data perspective?
Well, considering, the foundation behind the question, and I'm so glad to hear what Celeste and Bo are saying relative to how it's being approached in their organizations, it is a strategic imperative as opposed to a separate item. And diversity, inclusion, and human resources and talent management is a significant contributor to the execution of a strategy. The business case around how the data will help maximize the effectiveness of executing against the business strategy is the foundation behind the ask for HR, for an HR leader. And it's becoming even more of a recognition by CEOs as something to invest in order to be able to understand where the areas of opportunity are for intervention or area opportunities to leverage the same way that they employ the same energy and the same muscle in building their individual businesses. So I think the business case for that element of it is clearer now as a result of people wanting to be clear about what I call sustainable outcomes, but as connecting it directly to the strategic direction of the organization and how it will benefit the organization financially from a strategic perspective is the way to think about it. That increases the probability of being something that is added to the HR community if it doesn't exist already.
Yeah, new capabilities based on data. It seems like an important area to invest, particularly as we need to be efficient as possible coming out of this crisis period that we have been in. Thanks to all of you for the insights that you have shared, diversity leaders from across a spectrum of industries.